Racist bikers attack Michelle Obama, unaware that Barack Obama is secretly watching their every move. What happens next will leave them stunned. Subscribe for more stories and share this video with your friends. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The sun dipped low in the horizon, streaking the sky with muted shades of orange and lavender. The road stretched ahead, winding lazily through the countryside as Michelle Obama leaned back in the driver's seat of her rented SUV. The hum of the engine was a soothing backdrop to the steady rhythm of her thoughts, which felt oddly quiet for the first time in weeks. She had insisted on driving herself. No staff, no motorcade, no media, just her and the open road. The decision hadn't been easy. Bumping against security protocols was second nature by now, and convincing Barack had taken more effort than she'd expected. "Michelle, you can't just disappear into the wilderness," he'd said, his voice tight with worry. "You're not just anyone." "And that's the problem," she'd replied, not unkindly. "I need a break from being someone. Just for a little while." Barack eventually relented, though not without conditions. The Secret Service would be nearby, though out of sight, and she would have a secure satellite phone in case of emergencies. He'd kissed her goodbye that morning, his lips lingering on hers as though he were sending a prayer along with her. Now, miles away from the White House and the constant scrutiny that came with it, Michelle finally felt her shoulders relax. The small mountain town she was heading toward promised a quiet inn, home-cooked meals, and, most importantly, anonymity. She needed time to breathe, to exist without the weight of expectations pressing down on her. As she drove, the scenery shifted. Rolling hills gave way to clusters of trees, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. It reminded her of childhood trips to visit her grandparents, when she and her brother would play card games to pass the time. She smiled at the memory, feeling a pang of nostalgia for simpler days. The calm was interrupted when she noticed a group of motorcyclists on the side of the road ahead. Their bikes were lined up in a jagged row, chrome glinting in the fading light. The riders themselves leaned against their machines, clad in leather jackets and dark jeans. She might not have given them a second thought, except for the way their heads turned in unison as her SUV approached. Michelle's grip tightened on the steering wheel. She wasn't one to jump to conclusions, but something about the way they watched her, silent and still, sent a ripple of unease through her. She forced herself to look straight ahead as she passed them, refusing to meet their eyes. In the rearview mirror, she saw one of the men climb onto his bike, followed by the others. The low rumble of engines filled the air as they pulled onto the road behind her. Her pulse quickened. It could have been a coincidence. Plenty of people traveled these roads, bikers included, but the way they followed at a measured distance, never overtaking her or falling too far behind, felt deliberate. Michelle tapped the steering wheel nervously, debating whether to call the security team. She didn't want to overreact, didn't want to feel like the paranoid public figure who saw threats everywhere. But this wasn't D.C. She was alone out here, with no backup in sight. The SUV's navigation screen lit up with an incoming call. It was Barack. She exhaled sharply, thankful for the interruption. "Hey, you okay?" His voice carried that familiar tone of concern, like he could sense something was wrong even from hundreds of miles away. "Yeah, just enjoying the drive," she lied, forcing her voice to stay light. Barack hesitated. "You sure? You sound a little off." "I'm fine. Just not used to the quiet, I guess. Call me if you need anything." "I will," she promised, then ended the call before he could ask any more questions. The bikers were still there, their headlights glowing in the mirror like distant eyes. She tried to push the worry down, focusing instead on the road and the small diner she'd marked on the map. It wasn't far now, just another 15 minutes or so. She could stop, grab a coffee, and reassess. When she pulled into the gravel parking lot of the diner, the bikers rumbled past without stopping. Relief washed over her, though it didn't quite erase the lingering tension in her chest. The diner was exactly what she'd expected. Simple, with vinyl booths and faded photographs of the town's history on the walls. A few locals sat at the counter, chatting quietly. Michelle chose a booth by the window, where she could keep an eye on the parking lot. The waitress, a young woman with tired eyes and a warm smile, brought her coffee and a slice of pie without asking too many questions. Michelle appreciated that. She wasn't in the mood to make conversation. The door jingled and the air shifted. She looked up to see the bikers enter, their boots heavy against the tile floor. Her stomach sank. They didn't approach her right away. Instead, they spread out, taking over 2 booths and part of the counter. Their laughter was loud, their voices carrying easily through the small space. Michelle tried to ignore them, but it was impossible not to notice the way they kept glancing her way. One of them, a stocky man with a shaved head and a Confederate flag patch on his jacket, leaned back in his chair and muttered something that made the others laugh. Michelle didn't catch the words, but the tone was enough to make her skin crawl. She forced herself to finish her coffee, pretending not to notice as the stocky man stood and sauntered toward her table. "Didn't think we'd see your kind out here," he said, his voice dripping with false friendliness. Michelle looked up, meeting his gaze without flinching. "And what kind would that be?" His smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. "Fancy city folk?" Before she could respond, the waitress reappeared, her face pale but determined. "Leave her alone, Roy." Roy smirked but stepped back, raising his hands in mock surrender. Just being neighborly. The tension in the room was palpable as he returned to his booth. Michelle finished her coffee quickly, leaving cash on the table before heading to the door. The waitress followed her out. "I'm sorry about them," she said softly. "They're troublemakers, but they usually keep to themselves." Michelle nodded. "Thanks for stepping in." As she climbed back into her SUV, she noticed the bikers watching her from the window. Her heart pounded, but she forced herself to drive away calmly. In the mirror, she saw them climb back onto their bikes. The rumble of engines filled the air again, and dread settled like a stone in her stomach. She was being followed, and this time there was no denying it. The low growl of engines followed Michelle Obama as she navigated the winding country road. The diner's neon sign had long since faded into the distance, but the tension that lingered in her chest remained sharp and unyielding. She gripped the steering wheel tighter, stealing quick glances in the rearview mirror. The motorcycles trailed her, their headlights cutting through the encroaching darkness like predatory eyes. Michelle tried to calm the rising panic threatening to cloud her judgment. She wasn't just any woman traveling alone. She was someone who had faced threats before, someone who had been taught to control fear and rely on preparation. But the isolation of the road and the quiet menace of the bikers made those lessons feel distant. She reached for her phone, her fingers trembling slightly as she navigated to the emergency line pre-programmed by her security team. A weak signal flickered in the corner of the screen. She tapped the call button, but the line disconnected almost immediately. The signal bar faded completely, leaving her staring at the words, "No service." "Damn it," she muttered under her breath. The road curved sharply, and Michelle pressed down on the accelerator, hoping to create some distance between herself and the bikers. The SUV responded, surging forward, but the motorcycles roared to match her speed. They weren't just following her, they were toying with her. For the first time since the chase began, Michelle felt her confidence falter. She needed a plan, and she needed one fast. Her thoughts shifted to Barack. He had insisted on equipping her vehicle with a satellite-based tracking system. If the security team had noticed her deviation from the planned route or the sudden speed changes, they would already be moving. She held on to that hope even as doubt crept in. What if they didn't? What if they were too far to help in time? A blinding flash of light filled her mirrors. One of the bikers had pulled alongside her, shining a high-powered flashlight directly at her window. Michelle flinched, but kept her focus on the road. The biker pointed to the side of the road, signaling for her to pull over. She ignored him and accelerated again, her pulse pounding in her ears. The SUV responded with a low roar, its tires gripping the pavement as it sped up. But the bikers didn't back down. They closed ranks, tightening around her like a pack of wolves. Michelle forced herself to think. Running wasn't going to work. She needed to outsmart them, and that meant finding a place where she could turn the situation to her advantage. A sign loomed in the distance, a fork in the road. One path led to the highway, but the other veered into the forested hills. She took the second option, her headlights illuminating the rough terrain. It was a gamble, but she hoped the narrow, winding paths would slow the motorcycles down. The trees closed in as she left the main road behind, their branches forming a tunnel overhead. The bikers followed, their headlights flickering through the gaps in the foliage. Gravel crunched beneath her tires as she maneuvered along the uneven path, her eyes darting between the road ahead and the mirrors. Suddenly, a sharp turn appeared, and Michelle saw her chance. She yanked the wheel, sending the SUV skidding around the bend. The bikers weren't prepared for the maneuver. Two of them overshot the turn, struggling to regain control. It bought her a few precious seconds, but she knew it wouldn't last. She drove deeper into the woods, the path growing narrower and more treacherous. Branches scraped against the sides of the SUV, and rocks rattled beneath the tires. She spotted an old wooden bridge ahead and floored the accelerator, hoping to cross before the bikers could catch up. The bridge creaked ominously as she sped across, but it held. In the mirror, she saw the bikers hesitate. One of them gestured angrily, but the others didn't stop. They followed her across, their determination chilling in its intensity. Michelle's breath came in short, sharp bursts as she spotted a clearing ahead. It was too exposed to provide cover, but at least it gave her space to turn and regroup. She pulled into the clearing and killed the engine, her mind racing. The bikers emerged from the trees moments later, their engines rumbling as they fanned out to surround her. Michelle locked the doors and reached for the emergency flare tucked in the glove compartment, a last resort, but one she was prepared to use. One of the bikers dismounted. It was Roy, the man who had confronted her in the diner. He approached the SUV slowly, his expression predatory. "Get out of the car," he called, his voice echoing through the clearing. Michelle didn't move. Her grip tightened around the flare. "You're not going to find any help out here," he continued, circling the SUV. "No one's coming for you." He didn't know how wrong he was. Miles away, Barack Obama sat in a high-tech command center, his face tense as he studied the live feed from the satellite tracking system. Michelle's sudden detour and erratic movements had set off alarms, and his security team was already en route. "ETA, Barack demanded. 7 minutes, an agent replied. They're moving as fast as they can. Tell them to move faster. Back in the clearing, Michelle's mind raced. She couldn't let Roy see her fear. She met his gaze through the window, her expression steely. You don't want to do this, she said, her voice calm but firm. Roy laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. Lady, you don't get to tell me what I want. Michelle lit the flare. The bright red light filled the clearing, startling the bikers and momentarily blinding them. She threw the flare toward the edge of the clearing, hoping it would distract them long enough for her to make a move. It worked. The bikers flinched, and in that instant, Michelle restarted the SUV. Gravel sprayed as the tires dug in, and she shot forward, breaking through the line of bikes. But she didn't get far. One of the bikers caught up and rammed into the side of the SUV, forcing her to stop. Roy was already there, wrenching open the driver's side door before she could lock it again. For the first time, fear flashed in Michelle's eyes. But before Roy could drag her out, the sound of approaching vehicles shattered the tension. Black SUVs barreled into the clearing, their sirens piercing the night. Agents poured out, weapons drawn. Roy froze, his grip loosening just enough for Michelle to shove him back and slam the door. The tide had turned, and Michelle knew this was only the beginning. The clearing was alive with the wail of sirens and the shouts of agents as they surrounded the bikers, weapons drawn and orders flying. Michelle sat frozen in the driver's seat of her SUV, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Her breath came in shallow gasps as the reality of the situation settled over her like a heavy weight. She had been moments away from being dragged out of her car, moments away from whatever nightmare Roy and his gang had planned. But it wasn't over yet. The bikers, though startled by the sudden appearance of law enforcement, weren't going down without a fight. Roy shouted something unintelligible, and two of the bikers mounted their motorcycles, engines roaring to life. They peeled away from the clearing, gravel flying as their tires bit into the dirt road. The others hesitated, their eyes darting between the advancing agents and their leader. Roy's face twisted in rage. "Move!" he barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. And just like that, the clearing exploded into motion. The bikers scattered, some running for their bikes, others diving into the woods. Shots rang out. Warning shots, Michelle realized, but it did little to deter them. Roy was the last to move, his eyes locking with Michelle's through the windshield. He pointed a finger at her, a silent promise, before turning and sprinting for his motorcycle. "Go after them!" an agent shouted. Michelle barely registered the order before one of the agents approached her SUV, opening the door and extending a hand. "Mrs. Obama, are you hurt?" "I'm fine," she managed, though her voice shook. "Come with me. We're getting you out of here." "No." The word came out stronger than she expected. She looked past him at the agents piling into black SUVs, their tires already spinning as they took off after the bikers. "I'm not leaving until they're caught." "Ma'am?" "Don't argue with me," Michelle snapped, stepping out of the vehicle. Her legs wobbled, but she steadied herself. "I want to see this through." The agent hesitated, but finally relented. "Stay close, ma'am." They ushered her into one of the vehicles, and within seconds they were speeding down the dirt road. The night blurred around them, the headlights slicing through the dark and catching glimpses of trees and rocks as they navigated the narrow path. Michelle's heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her focus on the road ahead. The radio crackled. "Suspects are heading northbound, approaching Route 17, requesting backup." "They're trying to reach the highway," the driver muttered. Michelle clenched her fists. If they made it to the highway, they could scatter, disappearing into the night. They had to be stopped before that happened. Up ahead, the tail lights of the fleeing bikers flashed through the trees. The lead SUV accelerated, closing the distance. The bikers swerved, dodging potholes and debris, but the agents stayed on their trail. Suddenly, one of the bikers veered off the road, cutting through the trees in a desperate attempt to lose them. The agents split, half following the main group and half pursuing the lone rider. Michelle leaned forward in her seat, her eyes fixed on the remaining bikers. Roy was still among them, his hulking frame unmistakable even in the dim light. "He's not getting away," she muttered. The driver glanced at her. "We'll make sure of that." The chase spilled onto the highway, the roar of engines echoing off the asphalt. The bikers weaved through traffic, forcing cars to swerve and honk. The agents followed closely, their vehicles larger and more stable, but the motorcycles had the advantage of speed and agility. Michelle gripped the edge of her seat as one of the bikers kicked at an agent's SUV, trying to force it off the road. The agent responded by nudging the bike's rear wheel, sending it skidding sideways. The rider lost control and tumbled onto the pavement, rolling before coming to a stop. The agents didn't slow. Another biker tried to make a sharp turn onto an exit ramp, but an agent anticipated the move and cut him off, forcing him to crash into a guardrail. That left Roy and one other rider. They pushed their bikes to the limit, engines screaming as they raced toward a bridge spanning a wide river. Michelle's stomach dropped. If they made it across, they could disappear into the maze of roads on the other side. "Faster!" she urged. The SUV surged forward, gaining on the bikers. Roy glanced back, his face twisted in fury. He swerved, trying to block their path, but the agent driving Michelle's vehicle didn't flinch. He rammed the side of Roy's bike, sending it skidding toward the edge of the road. Roy managed to keep control, but the other biker wasn't so lucky. He hit a patch of loose gravel and went down hard, his bike spinning out of control. Roy was alone now. He turned onto the bridge, his bike fishtailing as he pushed it to its limits. The agents followed, closing in on him with every second. Michelle held her breath as the gap narrowed. Suddenly, Roy slammed on his brakes, skidding sideways and forcing the lead SUV to swerve. The vehicle clipped the guardrail, but the driver recovered quickly. Roy took the chance to turn off the bridge, veering down a dirt path that ran along the riverbank. Michelle's SUV followed, the tires kicking up dust as they left the pavement behind. The path grew rougher, lined with rocks and overgrown bushes. Roy struggled to maintain speed, and Michelle knew his bike couldn't handle the terrain for long. And then it happened. Roy hit a deep rut, and his bike bucked violently. He lost control, the motorcycle flipping and sending him flying into the dirt. He rolled several times before coming to a stop, motionless. The SUV screeched to a halt, and agents poured out, weapons drawn. Michelle stepped out, her eyes locked on Roy as he groaned and tried to push himself up. Blood trickled from a gash on his forehead, but his eyes burned with defiance. "It's over," Michelle said, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. Roy glared at her, his chest heaving. "This ain't over," he spat. But as the agents cuffed him and hauled him to his feet, Michelle knew he was wrong. For now, at least, it was. The world had narrowed to the sound of heavy breathing and boots crunching against gravel. The sharp scent of oil and smoke lingered in the air as the agents secured the scene, but Michelle Obama couldn't shake the chill that crept along her spine. Even with Roy in handcuffs, the echoes of his threats lingered, each word heavy with venom. "It's over," she had told him. Yet, as she stood near the wreckage of his fallen motorcycle, she knew those words were more of a reassurance to herself than a definitive truth. The man's eyes had burned with something deeper than anger, a hatred that wasn't easily extinguished. The agents moved quickly, inspecting the scene and scanning the surrounding area for signs of other threats. The clearing, lit only by the harsh beams of headlights, felt vast and yet suffocatingly confined. Roy sat slumped on the ground, blood streaking down his face, but his gaze never wavered from Michelle. One of the agents approached her. "We need to move you, Mrs. Obama. This area isn't secure." Michelle nodded, her muscles tight with adrenaline, but she hesitated before stepping away. Her eyes lingered on Roy, searching his face for answers he refused to give. What had driven him and his gang to target her so ruthlessly? Was this random, or was it part of something larger? "Don't waste your time trying to figure him out," the agent said, following her gaze. "He's already lost." Michelle wasn't so sure. As they led her back to the SUV, the night seemed darker, heavier. The flash of blue and red lights painted the trees in violent bursts of color, but the shadows remained deep and unbroken. She climbed into the vehicle, the door slamming shut behind her like the closing of a vault. The SUV rumbled to life, and they began to pull away from the scene. Michelle glanced back, half expecting Roy to make one last attempt to escape, but he remained still, surrounded by agents. Yet the unease in her chest refused to subside. They had caught him, but the chase didn't feel over. The SUV turned onto the main road, its tires humming against the asphalt, and Michelle leaned her head against the window. The adrenaline had started to fade, leaving exhaustion in its wake, but her mind wouldn't stop racing. Roy's gang hadn't been acting on impulse. She was sure of it now. The way they had coordinated their movements, the precision of their pursuit, it felt planned. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sharp crackle of the radio. "Dispatch to command. We have movement reported near the perimeter. Possible reinforcements." Michelle's stomach dropped. The driver tightened his grip on the wheel. "ETA? 3 minutes out," came the reply. Michelle sat up straighter. "What's going on?" The agent in the passenger seat turned to her, his expression grim. "Looks like they're not alone." The SUV accelerated, the headlights slicing through the night. Michelle's pulse quickened. The road ahead twisted sharply, leading deeper into the forested hills. Trees pressed in from both sides, their branches casting jagged shadows across the pavement. The radio crackled again. Multiple bikes spotted, moving fast. Michelle clenched her fists. She thought it was over. She thought Roy's arrest would end it, but now it felt like the trap was just beginning to close. The SUV skidded around a curve, and the first glint of headlights appeared in the rearview mirror. The agents didn't hesitate. The vehicle surged forward, tires squealing as it picked up speed. "They're gaining," the driver muttered. Michelle's eyes darted to the mirror. The motorcycles were closing in, their silhouettes weaving through the dark like predators on the hunt. The agent in the passenger seat radioed for backup, his voice clipped and urgent. "Engaging pursuit. 6 bikes confirmed, requesting immediate reinforcement." The response came quickly. "ETA 4 minutes, hold position." Michelle didn't need to be told what that meant. They were on their own until help arrived. The bikers were nearly on them now. One of them accelerated, pulling alongside the SUV. Michelle caught a glimpse of his face, twisted in a snarl as he swung a chain against the window. The glass cracked but held. The driver veered sharply, forcing the biker to swerve, but another one took his place. Michelle's heartbeat pounded in her ears. She felt the vehicle lurch as one of the bikers rammed the rear bumper. The SUV wobbled, but the driver kept control, pushing forward. "Hold on," he shouted. Michelle braced herself as the SUV barreled down the narrow road, but the bikers weren't backing off. One of them pulled ahead, trying to cut them off. "Not happening," the driver growled. He slammed the wheel to the left, clipping the biker's back tire. The motorcycle spun out, crashing into the trees, but the others kept coming. Michelle's gaze darted between the chaos outside and the dashboard clock. 3 minutes until backup arrived. It felt like an eternity. Suddenly, the road ahead forked. "Which way?" the driver shouted. "Left," Michelle snapped, making a split-second decision. The SUV swerved, tires skidding as it took the turn. The narrow road climbed steeply, forcing the bikers to slow down, but they didn't stop. The radio crackled again. "Backup approaching from the north. Hold your position." The road leveled out, opening into another clearing. The SUV came to a sudden stop, and Michelle's breath caught. The bikers were already there, waiting. Roy might have been in cuffs, but his gang hadn't been deterred. They had anticipated this move, and now Michelle was surrounded. The agents stepped out of the SUV, weapons drawn, but the bikers didn't flinch. Michelle stayed inside, her eyes scanning the clearing for any possible escape. "Put your weapons down," one of the agents ordered. The lead biker, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, stepped forward. "You don't give the orders here." Michelle's pulse quickened. This wasn't just a gang of thugs, this was something bigger, organized, deliberate, and they weren't backing down. The tension thickened as the agents and bikers faced off. Michelle's mind raced. She couldn't let it end here. Suddenly, the roar of engines filled the air. More SUVs barreling into the clearing. The bikers hesitated, and that was all the agents needed. Shots rang out, not aimed to kill, but to disarm and scatter. The bikers faltered, some diving for cover, others trying to flee. The agents moved swiftly, subduing the remaining bikers. Michelle stepped out of the SUV, her legs shaky but steady enough to carry her toward the chaos. It was over. For real this time. But as the agents secured the last of the gang, Michelle couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something far more dangerous. The clearing buzzed with the hum of engines and the crackle of radios as the last of the bikers were rounded up and restrained. Michelle Obama stood near the edge of the chaos, her hands trembling slightly as the adrenaline began to wear off. Despite the layers of professionalism displayed by the agents around her, the night still felt raw and unstable, as though it could unravel at any moment. Roy sat slumped on the ground, his wrists bound behind his back with zip ties. Blood from the gash on his forehead had dried in uneven streaks across his face, but his eyes still burned with the same unrelenting hatred. Even in defeat, he radiated defiance. Michelle found herself unable to look away, as if by keeping him in her sight, she could somehow keep him contained. One of the agents approached her, his steps brisk but careful. "Mrs. Obama, we've secured the suspects. Reinforcements are sweeping the area to make sure there are no stragglers." Michelle nodded, but her eyes remained locked on Roy. "Is he talking?" The agent hesitated. "Not yet. He's demanding a lawyer and refusing to cooperate." "Of course he is," she said softly. She took a step closer, ignoring the instinctive protests from the agents nearby. She needed to see him up close, to confront the man who had turned her quiet retreat into a nightmare. Roy's eyes followed her as she approached, his lips curling into something that was neither a smile nor a snarl. "Well, well," he said, his voice rough. Look who's come to gloat." Michelle stood firm. "I'm not here to gloat," she said. "I want to know why." Roy's smile faded, replaced by something darker. "Why?" He leaned forward as much as his restraints would allow. "Because people like you think you own this country. You walk around acting like you built it, like you deserve everything handed to you." Michelle's stomach tightened, but she kept her voice steady. "I worked for everything I have, and I never claimed to own anything." Roy laughed, sharp and humorless. "You didn't have to. Your kind just takes." His words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of years of resentment. Michelle recognized that bitterness. It wasn't just about her. It was about the world Roy believed had turned against him, leaving him to fester in his anger until it consumed him. "You don't even know me," she said. "You don't know anything about my life." "I know enough," Roy snapped. "I know you're just another fraud, pretending to care about people like me while you sit in your mansions and make speeches about equality." Michelle took a deep breath, willing herself to stay calm. "You're angry," she said. "I get that. But this, threatening me, chasing me down, that's not about justice. That's about hate." Roy's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. "Tell me," she pressed, "who put you up to this? Was this just about me, or was there more to it?" Roy's eyes flickered for the briefest moment. Hesitation, fear. Then he shut down, leaning back against the tree trunk and looking away. "Take him," Michelle said to the nearest agent. "Get him out of my sight." The agents moved quickly, hauling Roy to his feet and leading him toward one of the waiting vehicles. Michelle watched until he disappeared from view, but the tension in her chest didn't ease. Another agent approached. "Mrs. Obama, we need to get you to a secure location. The perimeter is clear, but we can't rule out other threats." Michelle nodded, allowing herself to be escorted back to the SUV. The vehicle's interior felt stifling, the leather seats too smooth and unfamiliar against her skin. She leaned back, closing her eyes for a moment, but the images of the night replayed themselves in sharp detail. The chase, the threats, the look in Roy's eyes. She opened her eyes and reached for the satellite phone. It rang twice before Barack's voice filled the line. "Michelle?" His voice was tight, strained. "I'm okay," she said quickly, hearing the relief in his exhale. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure." She hesitated, then added, "But it's not over." "What do you mean?" She looked out the window as the SUV pulled away from the clearing, the dark forest pressing in on either side. This wasn't random, Barack. It wasn't just a bunch of angry bikers. They were organized. And Roy, he's not talking, but there's something bigger behind this. Barack's silence spoke volumes. "We're already digging into it," he said finally. "But I need you safe. You're coming home." Michelle wanted to argue, but she knew he was right. The agents had done their job, and now it was time to let the investigation unfold. Still, a part of her bristled at the idea of retreating, while questions remained unanswered. The SUV picked up speed as it hit the main road, and Michelle leaned back in her seat, trying to focus on the fact that she was out of immediate danger. But even as the headlights carved through the night, illuminating the road ahead, she couldn't shake the feeling that shadows still lingered just out of sight. She thought about Roy's words, about the venom in his voice. It wasn't personal, it was systemic. He was a symptom of something deeper, something that wouldn't be fixed by a single arrest. Michelle clenched her fists. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Back at the clearing, agents sifted through the wreckage of the motorcycles and the belongings left behind. Among the scattered debris, one agent picked up a battered notebook. Flipping it open, he frowned at the contents. handwritten lists, maps, and sketches that suggested plans far more extensive than a single ambush. He snapped the notebook shut and radioed his findings. "Command, we've got something." The agent's voice was grim. This wasn't just a gang, it was a network. The SUV's tires hummed against the asphalt as Michelle Obama stared out the window, her thoughts tangled in the chaos of the night. Trees blurred past in streaks of black and green, but her mind wasn't focused on the passing scenery. It lingered instead on the cold stare Roy had fixed on her and the venom in his voice. She replayed their brief exchange over and over, dissecting his words and tone. It wasn't just anger. Anger was raw and reactive. This was something far more deliberate. A conviction rooted so deeply that it had driven him to orchestrate an attack with precision and intent. It made her uneasy. People didn't just wake up one day and decide to hunt someone like her. There were layers to this, connections she couldn't yet see, and the weight of those unknowns pressed heavily on her chest. The satellite phone rang, jolting her out of her thoughts. "Michelle?" Barack's voice came through clearly, but there was an edge to it. "I'm here," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "They've taken the suspects into custody," he said, "but the investigation's already turning up more than we expected." Michelle leaned forward, her pulse quickening. "What did they find?" Barack hesitated. "It looks like this group wasn't just acting alone. They're connected to several other cells across the country, militant groups with ties to white supremacist organizations. The notebook they recovered from the scene is filled with maps, contact lists, and plans for more attacks." Michelle's stomach dropped. "More attacks? On who?" "So far, it looks like they were targeting political figures and activists, anyone they saw as a threat to their ideology. You were at the top of their list." Her grip tightened on the phone. "And Roy?" "He's not talking yet, but the evidence is piling up. They found encrypted messages on his phone, codes we're still trying to crack. It's bigger than we thought, Michelle. This wasn't just some random hate crime. This was organized." Michelle exhaled slowly, trying to keep her emotions in check. "So, what's next?" "We'll break them," Barack said firmly. "We've already got the FBI working through the data. They're piecing together the network, but it's going to take time. For now, you need to focus on staying safe." Michelle glanced out the window again, the dark forest pressing in around her. "Safe," she echoed, though the word felt hollow. The SUV slowed as they approached a checkpoint. Agents with flashlights waved them through, and Michelle saw a second convoy of vehicles waiting beyond the barrier. More agents stepped out, scanning the area and speaking into radios. "We're almost there," the driver said. The "there" in question was a secure facility, a temporary base set up to house the investigation. It was isolated but fortified, with fences and cameras lining the perimeter. Michelle didn't argue as she was escorted inside, though every instinct in her body told her to keep moving, to keep searching for answers rather than sitting still. Inside, agents moved with purpose, their voices low but urgent as they coordinated efforts. Michelle was led to a small room where Barack was already waiting, his tie loosened and his face lined with tension. "You look terrible," she said, managing a faint smile. "So do you," he replied, stepping forward to pull her into his arms. The embrace was brief but grounding, and Michelle drew strength from it. They sat down, and Barack slid a folder across the table. "You need to see this." Michelle opened it, her eyes scanning the documents inside. Names, photographs, reports. The scope of the operation hit her immediately. This wasn't just a single group of bikers acting on impulse. It was a web connected by ideology and fueled by hatred. "They've been planning this for months," Barack said. "Recruiting, organizing. Roy's gang was just one part of it." Michelle's eyes landed on a photograph of a man she didn't recognize. Sharp features, slicked back hair, and a scar above his eyebrow. "Who's this?" "Martin Gates," Barack said. "Ex-military. He's one of the ringleaders. We think he's been coordinating these cells and supplying them with weapons." Michelle's pulse quickened. "Have you found him?" "Not yet. He's gone underground, but we're closing in." She shut the folder, her hands trembling. "They're not done." "No," Barack agreed, "but neither are we." The room fell silent for a moment before Michelle leaned back, her mind racing. "I need to talk to Roy again." Barack frowned. "What?" "No." "Barack." "No," he said firmly. "You're not going anywhere near him." "You saw the reports," she argued. "He knows more than he's letting on. If we don't get him to talk—" "That's the FBI's job," Barack cut in. "Not yours." Michelle opened her mouth to protest, but the look in his eyes stopped her. He wasn't just speaking as the former president. He was speaking as her husband. "I won't let you put yourself in danger again," he said softly. Michelle swallowed her frustration and nodded. "Okay." But as much as she wanted to believe the investigation would wrap up quickly, she knew better. These things took time, and time wasn't something they had in abundance. Hours passed as agents continued to analyze data and interview suspects. Michelle remained at the base, alternating between restless pacing and long stretches of silence. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something, that the other shoe was about to drop. Late into the night, one of the agents burst into the room. "We've cracked the codes," he said breathlessly, "and we've got an address." Michelle sat up straighter. Barack was already moving. "Where?" "An abandoned warehouse outside of town. We think it's where Gates has been operating." Michelle stood. "I'm coming with you." Barack spun around. "No, you're not." "Barack." "No," he said sharply. "You've done enough. Let us handle this." Michelle hesitated, but the look in his eyes made her step back. "Fine," she said, "but bring him in." Barack nodded and turned to the agents. "Let's move." As the team mobilized, Michelle stood by the window, watching the convoy of vehicles roll out. She wanted to be there, to see it through, but she knew her place was here. For now. She pressed her palm against the cool glass, her reflection staring back at her with tired eyes. This wasn't over yet, but at least they were closer. And no matter what it took, she wouldn't let hate win. The sun was beginning to rise when Michelle Obama stepped outside the secure facility. The first streaks of light painted the horizon in pale gold, pushing back the darkness that had lingered through the night. But, despite the dawn breaking overhead, the weight in her chest remained. The events of the past 24 hours replayed themselves on an endless loop in her mind, each moment sharp and unrelenting. The facility grounds buzzed with activity. Agents moved between vehicles and tents, coordinating the next steps of the investigation. Helicopters hovered in the distance, their blades slicing through the morning air, and black SUVs lined the perimeter, engines idling as teams prepared for deployment. The operation was far from over, but there was a sense of cautious progress. Michelle leaned against the hood of her vehicle, clutching a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. She had barely touched it, her hands too restless to stay still. Her eyes tracked the movements of the agents searching for Barack among them. He had been gone for hours, leading the raid on the warehouse where Martin Gates had supposedly been hiding. The minutes dragged. She hated waiting, especially now, when every passing moment felt like it carried the weight of 1,000 unanswered questions. Finally, a convoy of SUVs appeared on the horizon, their headlights cutting through the haze. Michelle's breath caught as the vehicles rolled through the gates, agents spilling out with a mixture of urgency and exhaustion. She searched their faces, looking for any sign of victory or failure. Barack stepped out of the lead vehicle. His expression unreadable, Michelle set her coffee down and walked toward him, her pulse quickening. "Well?" she asked as soon as he was within earshot. Barack wiped his brow, his shoulders heavy with fatigue. "We got him." Relief washed over her, but it was quickly followed by a surge of questions. "Alive?" "Yes," he confirmed. "He didn't resist as much as we expected, but there's more." Michelle frowned. "What do you mean?" Barack's eyes darkened. The warehouse wasn't just a hideout. It was a hub. Weapons, supplies, communication equipment. This wasn't just a gang, Michelle. This was a network preparing for something bigger. Her stomach churned. "How big?" "We're still piecing it together, but it's national," he said. "Multiple cells, coordinated attacks. They weren't just targeting you. They had plans for government buildings, community centers, protests. Roy and his gang were only the tip of the spear." Michelle exhaled slowly, the magnitude of the threat settling over her like a lead blanket. "And Gates?" "He's talking. More than Roy ever did," Barack said. "It looks like Roy was just one of his lieutenants, someone who could be sacrificed if things went wrong. Gates was the real planner, and he's naming names." Michelle felt a flicker of satisfaction at the thought, but it was quickly replaced by unease. The idea that this plot had reached so far, touched so many corners of the country, was deeply unsettling. "What happens now?" she asked. Barack ran a hand through his hair. "The FBI's taken over. Gates is being transferred to a secure location, and the other cells are already under surveillance. It's going to be a long process, but this is the beginning of the end for them." "The beginning," Michelle echoed, her voice tinged with doubt. "But not the end." Barack studied her for a moment before stepping closer. "You're right," he admitted. "This kind of hate doesn't disappear overnight, but this is a blow, a big one, and it's going to make it harder for them to operate." Michelle nodded, though her thoughts were far from settled. She knew the arrests would make headlines and the public would demand answers. But for every person who saw the news as a victory, there would be others who viewed it as an attack on their beliefs, fuel for the fire that had already burned too long and too hot. Later that day, Michelle and Barack attended a press conference. The room was packed with reporters, cameras flashing as they stepped up to the podium. Michelle took a steadying breath, reminding herself why she was there. Not just to address the events of the past day, but to send a message. Barack spoke first, outlining the facts of the investigation and emphasizing the importance of vigilance against domestic terrorism. Michelle listened carefully, her hands folded on the podium in front of her. When it was her turn to speak, she looked out at the crowd and let her voice carry. "This isn't just about me," she began. "It's about what we stand for as a country. The people who targeted me and others like me weren't just acting out of anger, they were acting out of fear. Fear of losing power, of losing control. But fear is not an excuse for violence, and it's not an excuse for hate." She paused, letting the words settle. "The threats we face today aren't new. They've been with us for generations, hiding in plain sight. But what we saw this week is a reminder that hate doesn't disappear when we ignore it. It grows. It organizes, and it becomes dangerous. Michelle met the cameras head-on. But it can also be defeated, not just with arrests and investigations, but with unity, with education, with the courage to stand up and say, "Not here, not now, not ever." The room erupted in applause, but Michelle barely heard it. Her focus was on the faces in the crowd, some hopeful, some skeptical, and a few that mirrored the same anger she had seen in Roy's eyes. After the conference, Michelle returned to the secure facility, where she finally allowed herself a moment to breathe. She sat in one of the empty offices, staring at the reports spread out before her. The investigation would continue, and more arrests would follow. But the larger fight, the one against the roots of hate, was far from over. Barack found her there, his presence grounding as he leaned against the doorframe. "You did good today," he said softly. Michelle looked up, her expression tired but resolute. "So did you." He crossed the room and took her hand. "We'll get through this, together." Michelle nodded, squeezing his hand. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she also knew they wouldn't face it alone. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the facility, Michelle felt the weight of the day begin to lift. The fight wasn't over, but they had taken the first step, and sometimes that was enough. The hum of the helicopter faded as Michelle Obama stepped out onto the lawn of their Washington, D.C. residence. The early evening light bathed the house in a warm glow, but the serenity of the setting did little to quiet the storm inside her. She paused for a moment, breathing in the crisp air, before walking toward the entrance where Barack was waiting. The past days had stretched into a blur of briefings, interviews, and relentless updates from law enforcement. The network they had uncovered was broader than anyone had anticipated. Cells operating in multiple states, all connected by encrypted communications and stockpiles of weapons. Arrests were still ongoing, but Michelle knew that breaking up the organization was only part of the battle. The ideology that fueled it remained intact, festering in the shadows, waiting for another opportunity to strike. Barack stepped forward, his gaze steady as he took her hands in his. "You're home," he said softly, as though speaking the words would make them real. "For now," Michelle replied, though her voice betrayed the lingering tension. "But it doesn't feel over." "It's not," Barack admitted. "But we made progress, and that matters." Michelle studied his face, searching for reassurance. Despite the exhaustion etched into his features, there was a determination in his eyes that steadied her. She nodded, letting him lead her inside. The house felt different, quieter, heavier, like it was still holding the weight of everything that had happened. Michelle dropped her bag by the door and sank into the couch, her body aching in ways that had nothing to do with a physical exhaustion. "I keep thinking about Roy," she said finally, "and Gates, about how sure they were that they were right." Barack sat beside her, his arm resting along the back of the couch. "People like them thrive on fear," he said. "Fear of change, of losing control. And when they can't hold on to power, they try to tear everything else down." Michelle nodded slowly. "But it's more than that, isn't it? It's not just fear. It's anger, resentment, and it's been building for years." Barack exhaled. "You're right. It didn't start with them and it won't end with them. But what we do now, how we respond, that's what matters." Michelle leaned back, her thoughts spiraling. "I gave that speech," she said quietly. "I stood there and told people to stand up to hate. But what if that's not enough? What if it's never enough?" Barack turned to her, his expression soft but unwavering. "It's not about being enough," he said. It's about being present, about showing up, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. His words settled over her, grounding her. She knew he was right, but the uncertainty still gnawed at her. Later that night, Michelle sat alone in her study, flipping through the reports the FBI had sent over. The details were staggering. Coded messages, secret meetings, caches of weapons hidden in rural compounds. It read like a plot out of a movie, but the reality of it was far more terrifying. She lingered over Roy's profile, her eyes tracing the lines of his mugshot. He looked defiant, even in defeat. But there was something else there, too, a flicker of desperation beneath the bravado. Michelle couldn't stop thinking about the moment they'd faced each other in the clearing, about the words he'd thrown at her. He had spoken with conviction, but it had been fueled by fear, the kind of fear that turned people into weapons. And she knew fear wasn't something that could be dismantled with handcuffs and court dates. It had to be confronted at its source. The next morning, Michelle woke to find a stack of newspapers waiting on the kitchen counter. The headlines blared the details of the arrests, the dismantling of the network, and the broader implications of domestic terrorism. But one headline caught her eye: a new battle for unity. She unfolded the paper, reading through an editorial that called for national dialogue and stronger action against hate groups. It wasn't the first time she'd seen such calls, but this time it felt different, more urgent, more personal. Barack walked in as she finished reading, a mug of coffee in hand. "Good news or bad?" he asked. "A little of both," Michelle replied, setting the paper down. Barack sat across from her, his eyes searching hers. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking we can't let this moment slip away," she said. "People are paying attention now, they're listening, and we need to give them something to hold on to." Barack smiled faintly. "That sounds like a plan." Over the next few weeks, Michelle threw herself into action. She met with community leaders, educators, and activists, using her platform to amplify conversations about prejudice, systemic racism, and the power of education to fight hate. She spoke at town halls and universities, sharing her experiences and urging people to take a stand. But it wasn't just about words. Michelle pushed for tangible action, funding programs to support at-risk communities, promoting diversity training, and advocating for policies to combat domestic terrorism. It was exhausting, but it felt necessary. And slowly, she began to see change. Letters poured in from people across the country, stories of families talking about race for the first time, of schools introducing new programs to teach tolerance, of communities coming together to push back against hate. One letter, in particular, stuck with her. It was from a young woman in a small town who had attended one of Michelle's speeches. "I used to think people like Roy were unstoppable," the letter read. "But now I see they're just scared, and scared people can be helped. Thank you for showing me that." Michelle read the letter twice, her eyes stinging with tears. Barack found her later that night, still holding the letter. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded. "Yeah, I think we're getting somewhere." He smiled, wrapping an arm around her. "You always do." Michelle looked out the window, her reflection blending with the city lights beyond the glass. The fight wasn't over. She knew that. But for the first time in days, the weight in her chest felt lighter. The world wasn't perfect. It was messy and complicated and sometimes frightening, but it was also resilient. And as long as people were willing to stand up, to speak out, and to keep fighting, there was hope. And hope, Michelle realized, was more powerful than fear. If you like this story, subscribe to the channel not to miss new stories. Share this video with your friends and leave your comments. We'd love to know what you think.